what the city is talking about.
The news that impacts you.
Welcome to the Montreal Now Podcast.
All right, I want to get to this next story because I didn't, quite frankly, think this was a big deal anymore. Pandemic's been over now for a couple of years. Everyone is slowly but surely going back to the office, but the suggestion from our next guest, well, first of all, I should explain. She is a talent and leadership development specialist. She's based in Calgary. Her name is Eileen Dooley, and she's on the line. And Eileen, you take a bit of a different sort of tact at this one because the first paragraph or the first sentence that I read in the story that's in the Globe and Mail says the September routine will be different this year than the last few years because of the sudden and largely poorly explained urge to return to the office for more days. So explain first of all, because I'm getting the impression you think this is not a good idea, clearly.
It's partly about not being a good idea, but the other side is how it's coming together. We're seeing a lot of situations where the decision is just made. It's either made by one person at the senior leadership level, and the rationale behind it is not authentic. So when employers are saying that it's promoting teamwork, it's promoting bonding, it's promoting being able to work better with your leader, that's all fine, except they're not going into any more detail or citing any sources behind that, when ideally, or realistically, what it's about is someone just wants them back in the office full time. And so this is the trend that we're seeing right now, and I heard about this numerous times over the summer, whereas companies had, say, a flexible work policy, or you're in the office 2 or 3 days a week, and then you get to work from home for 2 or 3 days of the week. Now it's returning to the office 4 to 5 days a week on even if it's 4 days in September, and then say 5 days in January. And it's not an authentic answer to employees. They want to know, if you just want us in the office, have us in the office and tell us that. But don't say because it's to promote more productivity or promote more bonding with your leaders or your team or bonding with your colleagues. Say it's because you want them back in the office.
Okay, I'm trying to understand this because it would seem to, unless I'm completely wrong here, and when you said at the beginning about studies, are there not studies that show that exactly is the case, or are there studies showing it's not the case? That having everybody back and working with everybody else is, in fact, more beneficial?
The studies are showing that when you have a flexible work policy, and I'm not talking about working exclusively from home, I'm talking about a flexible work policy, mandating employees to come back into the office 4 or 5 days a week is hardly flexible. A flexible work policy the studies have shown it promotes more employee attrition, they're more engaged, and they're actually more productive when you give them the flexibility. And plus, if you want your employees to be flexible, well, the employer needs to be flexible as well. There hasn't been much data that has proven that you are more productive at the office. Or should I say less productive at home? Because that's not the case. And if you talk to workers, they will tell you that they're extremely productive, and they're also very happy to be working from home or having the choice to do so. So they can work their own hours.
Yeah. No, go ahead.
They can work their own hours. So say they want to work from 8 o'clock to 4, or they want to work from 7 o'clock to 3. If they need to take a break in between to throw a load of laundry in, which we all know takes 5 minutes, if not less, which is a lot less time than it takes to do the Starbucks run for coffee at the office, which usually is about 20 to 30 minutes. They like that flexibility, and they like to have control on their time.
So you can imagine there are people listening to you going through this and thinking to themselves, wait a sec, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, before the pandemic even happened, everyone was at the office 5 days a week. There was never even a discussion of having this kind of hybrid work schedule. And now we have to, even though the pandemic's, in the rearview mirror, now we have to go ahead and continue to have a system that was in place only because we had a pandemic. And what sense does that make?
Well, yes, people had to work from home. If they had a job where they could work from home, they did work from home. Well, what can we learn from that? Because what you're asking is, let's just go back to the way things were in 2019.
Yeah.
It's almost like saying, let's go back to when we didn't have email, or we had typewriters instead of computers.
To be fair,
think of it as advancing.
Okay, it's not quite the same. What I'm saying was for these big institutions like banks, for example, right, who had their employees in offices 5 days a week, everybody was working 5 days a week. Then, of course, along came the pandemic, which forced, it wasn't optional. You had to have employees be home because they couldn't come to the office. You want to go back to that at least in a partial manner. But what are big companies telling you or what are they saying with respect to why they want to do this? Just what you said off the top, that it's more productive for them? And why are we choosing to believe that that's not necessarily the case? What would their motive be otherwise?
Ask the employee. That's what's not happening. Ask the employee, the ones that are directly affected, whether or not coming into the office 5 days a week is going to be beneficial. Some people prefer it, so let them. Again, that's what we call flexibility.
I see. Okay.
They want to come in 5 days a week, they can. But if they want to come in 3 days a week, why can't they do that? Are they not? And I'll also be very clear, when I hear about how employees have become, and I get this from some of the comments on my story, well, employees have become lazy. Nobody became lazy during the pandemic. They were lazy before. The pandemic didn't breed the lazy worker. They were lazy before. They just got away with it.
Yeah, well, that's just it. They did get away with it because they're at home. They could get away with it because we couldn't see what they weren't doing while they were at the office, right?
Right. Well, before the pandemic, they were lazy too. And so they're just being able to hide a lot easier at the office than they would be at home. So you're kind of just bringing them back to what they were before. It's not about the lazy worker. It is about decisions that are being made at the highest level of organizations without input from employees, input from human resources, human resources being asked to just implement it. And let's face it, as I said in my story, senior leaders, especially in large companies, they have different challenges than the average employee, right? They've got different lifestyles, which could have different challenges.
Look, I
so
get.
They may not have childcare concerns. They may not have elder care concerns, commuting concerns, etc.
Completely understand that, and that's true. And obviously, going back to the office 5 days a week, if you've had the luxury of staying home a couple of days a week and not having to fight traffic in the morning or afternoon, that's a big bonus. I guess my question, because we're going to run out of time, is do you have the sense that, corporate CEOs are listening to this and actually want to have that discussion, or is this kind of my way or the highway?
We're going to see, because when the decisions have been made, if a decision has been made that and you're seeing that with the banks, you see that also with the Ontario government, that it's going to be 4 or 5 days a week. The decision's been made. We'll see about how employers are going to want to have flexibility, and they will find employers who will provide them that. So we will see that as we go forward, whether or not employees are going to go for this.
Okay.
And they may. Some people do like working 5 days a week from the office, but a lot of it depends. It's not about productivity. It's about personal preference. And that is what flexibility is all about. It's about personal preference. And if you give people more flexibility, they will produce.
Sure, and they'll be happier. I don't question that at all. I just
Absolutely.
I just think the idea of, someone is going to whip out a study that will prove that productivity goes up if everybody's in the office 5 days a week, and then this becomes rather moot because you'd have to prove, no, that study is flawed somehow. So I don't know.
You're going to see studies on both sides of the spectrum.
I guess.
It's like any other issue. You'll see studies on both sides of the spectrum.
Eileen, I want to thank you for the time. I find this really fascinating. It's going to be interesting to see what happens come September. And also how many people decide, you know what, if my boss can't be flexible, I'll go look for another job where my boss can be. So
absolutely. I firmly believe you will see that.
Eileen, I thank you so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Bringing you the breaking news and the people making it. Montreal Now with Aaron Rand. CJAD 800.
So this is a story that kind of comes out of nowhere, and it's obviously concerning. A growing number of non-smokers who are healthy and active end up getting lung cancer. That's what the data is beginning to show. And especially women. And this is later stage lung cancer. So we thought we'd try to shed a little light on this. Shirley Quach is a registered respiratory therapist, director of person-centered care and programs at the Lung Health Foundation, and is on the line. Thanks so much for being here. It's difficult, of course, for people to look at a headline like this and think, well, wait a sec, why would this be happening? So what do we know, and are we able to pinpoint why this is happening?
Hi, thank you for having me on the show. So if we're talking about some of the risk factors, we have some hypotheses, so some guess as to why people who has never actually smoked may have a risk for developing lung cancer.
Okay.
And so there are a couple of different ones. So just to quickly go over it, for example, radon gas. So radon gas is one of those gas that is in the environment. It has no smell, has no taste, no color. It's naturally broken down in the environment, and it accumulates in homes and buildings over time. Another one that we've been talking about more recently is about air pollution. So fine particulate matter from traffic industry, and over the last couple of years, we've really seen it with the wildfire smoke.
Okay. What else?
So occupational exposures can be another one. So individuals who work with asbestos, diesel exhaust, arsenic, certain metals, they particularly have a higher risk in that industry. Again, it has to do with the air quality of the environment that they're working in. Also, secondhand smoke, even occasional exposure can cause a increased risk for developing lung cancer.
So my question is, as I hear you go through the factors here, we've known all this stuff, it would seem to me, for the longest time. Asbestos is something we've known about for the last 50 years. I know radon gas now. There's a way to detect radon gas. Are we only now beginning to understand that these sorts of exposures are causing this lung cancer?
So it's really hard to pinpoint which exact one is causing lung cancer, but again, it's a multitude of different factors that can contribute to the development of lung cancer. So we talked about the radon gas, the air pollution, the occupational exposures, secondhand smoke, so things in the environment. But we also have to remember that there are other factors. So for example, biological and genetic mutations in one's body. So for example, molecular changes at the cellular level. So people who have a family history of lung cancer may have an increased risk for lung cancer.
Oh, okay. Is there, with respect to the figure that I mentioned off the top, that women are more likely or are getting this more than men? What's the explanation there? Is there one?
So we have some hypotheses or some guesses as to why that might be the case. So one of these hypotheses or guesses that with the hormones, right? So we've known that particularly that estrogen could be a risk factor. It it could accelerate epidermal growth factor receptor as some of these cell biomarkers that can increase their risk for lung cancer or any cancer development. And then some other potential reasons, again, these are all guesses, we're not certain exactly as to why, some of the other mentioned environmental factors that we talked about, but also the possibility of air quality and pollution within where they're working, but also traditionally women have been cooking, so possibility to cooking fumes may be a potential reason, another risk factor to add to that list.
And for the women who are in fact the ones diagnosed with this, I mean, is this treatable? Is it, because I mentioned later stage cancer, I mean, how serious is it once that is something that's diagnosed? Yeah,
so here's the thing about lung cancer is that there are signs and symptoms. Sometimes you don't have any signs and symptoms in the early stages. It's really about screening and checking and getting appropriate screening and diagnosing in the early stages, especially if you know you have these increased risk factor. Now, it's once you identify that you're in the later stages of lung cancer, especially at stage 4, treatment options at that point are quite limited. So this is usually where it's difficult, right? So we really encourage that people who know that they have these risk factors to really have this conversation with their healthcare providers, their family physicians, so they can figure out what is the next best step, whether it being going to a lung cancer screening program, being referred to a cancer center, or to a thoracic surgeon for further investigation.
So that being the case, then, if you have it in your family, right, if it's hereditary, you want to go ahead and check as quickly, obviously, as you can, because you mentioned that as a potential risk factor. If at the same time, though, you've not had any other sort of warnings that you might have something, what can you do or should you do to just make yourself feel, comfortable that you've done whatever you need to do to make sure that you're not dealing with it?
Yeah, so this goes back to some of the risk factors that we had discussed, right? So, for example, the radon gas, there's no known safe level of how much radon exposure is okay, and it's really hard to pinpoint that exact number. So that's why it's very important to have a radon testing kit to ensure that you're testing for radon exposure in your homes, and also so that you can address that if there's high levels of radon. In terms of air pollution, we talk about wildfire, right? Over the last couple of years, we've seen more and more air pollution from not only traffic, industry, but also wildfires. So on days with poor air quality, it's important to wear a mask or stay indoors if that's possible. In terms of the occupational exposures that we spoke about as well, PPE, which is personal protective equipment. So wearing an N95, their respirators, those are also important tools that we can use to kind of reduce the risk for exposing ourselves to these environmental factors.
All right. I thank you so much for the time this afternoon. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
Okay.
The very latest news, reported and discussed. Welcome back to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
It is time to check in with Chris Dimakos. He's our CJAD 800 legal contributor. And Chris, you pose a rather interesting scenario today for all the Seinfeld fans out there. I'm sure they remember the particular episode where George Costanza walked into his boss's office on a Friday afternoon and quit like I think most people would only dream of, right? What did he do? He let his boss have it, ridiculed him, and then basically, complained about everything there was to complain about, and then just quit and walked out the job. And then what did he do? He realized he made a mistake and walked back in Monday morning like nothing had happened. Now, that was on a TV show. This happened apparently in real life, and you're going to talk about this particular case, which is called Bishop versus Rexall Canada. So fill us in.
Yeah, we had and this happens often, believe it or not. There's arguments and things get heated, and one of the employees basically says, you know what? He uses the words, I'm done. I am done here. And then the employer, his supervisor, was saying, oh, are you quitting? Are you resigning? And he says, yes, I am. And then he leaves, and he mentions to them that he's going to send his resignation letter that night. But that night comes around, he never sends a resignation letter. And then, lo and behold, the employee says, you know what? I didn't resign. It was a heated exchange, but I didn't want to resign, so I want to be at work. The employer was claiming, no, it was a resignation. He said the words, I quit. He told us that he was done. He shouldn't be working anymore, and that's what the court had to decide. And they went through all of the different testimonies, and in the end, what I found very interesting was the court said, anytime you have an emotional outbreak at work, you have to have a cooling off period. And that cooling off period, if the employer really wants to confirm a resignation, they have to go above and beyond just, instead of just banking on what the employee said during a heated exchange, they have to go out of their way to say, hey, we want to confirm your resignation, sign here, sign this document, and that has to happen after this so-called cooling off period. So what to take from this is that things happen at work. People are, we're not robots. There's a lot of emotion sometimes. There's a lot of stress sometimes. And what the courts are saying here is job stability is important, and you can't sever that relationship just because you had an off moment and you were emotional at that time. So it's important for a lot of people who might have done something like that in the heat of a moment and then regretted it and said, well, I don't have a claim here. I said the words I quit, so I basically resigned. Not so quick. If it happened during that time, you might have recourse to get your job back.
Okay, keyword is might have recourse, or is this pretty much a precedent, do you think, for people? Because you say there's situations like these that come up regularly.
Yeah, so it's a very strong precedent, and I could tell you that nothing's guaranteed, but anytime things happen when there's a lot of emotion involved, courts always try to say, okay, well, that shouldn't be relied upon like as if you're having a normal conversation where there's nothing emotional about it. So context and circumstances, that's one of the reasons why, some of the best litigators find themselves in employment law, because contrary to corporate where you have numbers and shares and all these financial information, you're dealing with people, and you're dealing with people. It's never the same. Every situation is unique. Everyone has off days. So Again, a lot of context would determine how good your claim would be and what happened. But no, there's no question about it. You don't want to say the words "I quit." You don't want to put yourself in a bad situation when you don't want to. You want to avoid using those words. You want to get out of those emotional meetings, or if you're having an argument, try and get out of there without making any declaration. But if it happens, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no hope for you. You should get some advice quickly and see if you can navigate your way back into your job, maybe with some changes.
Okay, so let me go back to this. I find this fascinating. This particular case that we're outlining here, beyond this guy just, losing it for a second, you said there was yelling, there were insults, there was a lot going on here. But then you brought up the idea of this guy saying, I will send you a resignation letter. That letter was never sent. So how much did that come into play when this thing eventually ended up in front of a judge? Oh,
it was huge. You put your finger right on it. That was probably the most important point. What the court said, and that said, listen, when it was time for him to send the resignation letter, as he didn't do it. And he didn't do it a few hours after the argument had happened. He probably had time to cool off and realize, hey, I don't want to lose my job here. I just had a really bad moment at work. So that was huge. And I could tell you when people talk about resignation all the time, and sometimes the resignation might come because you're left with no option but to leave. Work has gone so bad that you have no option. And there's a difference there. And it's important that people know there's constructive dismissal and there's resignation. Resignation comes from the employee. It's their own choice. They want to leave there on their own merit. There's nothing that's forcing them out. Constructive dismissal still has that same employee leaving work, but they feel like they were forced to leave. They were being pushed out. They were being demoted. They were being treated unfairly. So there's a fine line there between a resignation and a constructive dismissal. And it's important that if you have your job and you feel like, hey, I like my job, I like where I work, I like my salary, but the work conditions are becoming so hard for me and so toxic of an environment that I have no choice but to leave. It's not a resignation. That's a constructive dismissal, and you can get the exact same compensation if you file a claim, whether you were fired outright or whether you were pushed out implicitly, right? So they made it so that you had no choice but to do so. So again, job stability is really important. There's a lot of protections available to people. Just have to understand what the dynamic is, and you have to understand your situation, how successful you can be if you file a claim.
Okay, last question, so we still have a couple of seconds here. With the idea then of resignation, let's say that's what you opt to end up doing, what happens to severance in that case?
So if you are 100% voluntarily resigning, not because of what your employer forced you anyway out, there is no severance in that case. That you leave. One thing I will tell people that they don't consider, a lot of times we have people that are being recruited from competitors, and they'll say, okay, well, I'm getting paid $10,000 more if I jump ship and I go here, so I'm just going to resign on my current job. Understand that what you're leaving on the table is not just a job that pays less. You're leaving a lot of security there. So you have to put a value on that. If you were with a company for 10 years, you have many more protections on terms of job security than you would when you join someone for 1 or 2 weeks. So when you're evaluating offers, if you're dealing with a professional recruiter, you have to put a value on what that job security represents, because if you ever get fired from your new job, you will get maybe a week or two, versus working somewhere 10 years where you would be entitled to a lot more in terms of months of salary. So always important to not just look at the salary. What type of value are you leaving on the table when you leave from one company to go to the next? All
right, we leave it at that. Chris, thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
Chris Dimakos, our CJAD 800 legal contributor.
Because you don't want to miss a thing. Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
All right, we started the show today, our question of the day, about a situation that took place in Lindsay, Ontario, where a man minding his own business in his residence, and his home is broken into. Someone gets in, and that person actually has a weapon. Long story short, they get into a tussle, I guess. The assailant is stabbed. He has to be air-flown, like medevac, to Toronto because his injuries are serious enough they can't be treated there. And reaction to this, by the way, has been rather swift, and I would say a majority of people, and certainly when we asked the question, majority of people said, wait a sec, Are you telling me that this gentleman who was protecting his property and his life, he is the one charged right now with aggravated assault and assault with a weapon because he had a knife? And I guess there was a confrontation, and it turns out the assailant is the one who broke into his home, is the one who ended up with life-threatening conditions, while this man was arrested by local police and charged. So I mentioned at the time in setting up the question that we have laws in Canada, and yes, you are allowed to obviously use self-defense, but it comes with restrictions, if I could say that, and that restriction is reasonable force. So I was reading this story and came across our next guest's opinion on this, and I thought we should share this because I'm going to ask the question again when we come back after 4 o'clock. Self-defense is allowed in Canada, but, as I said, there are limitations. So let's try to find more on this story and say good afternoon to Tonya Kent. She's a criminal defense lawyer in Toronto. Ms. Kent, thank you for being on today. Appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me. Good afternoon.
You were reading online, I understand, people's comments on this, and as I said, most of the people, virtually everyone, said, wait a sec, if I was in this situation, I would have done the same thing this person did, and what do you tell me, that I would have been arrested for basically protecting myself? So explain why, in this particular case, although to be fair, we don't have all the details yet, why is sort of that the wrong approach here?
Right. So what the situation is that the police, in this circumstance, likely thought that there has been excessive force. Because although you can defend yourself in Canada, obviously from an intruder, there's no law that just expects you to lay down and let somebody assault you. I think people understand that. But the sort of force has to be reasonable and in proportion to the threat that you're facing. So, for example, if somebody comes with a gun, let's say, and they're pointing a gun at you, and you get a bat and you knock the gun out of their hand, and you hit them to make sure they're not going to get up and get the gun or get you again, you can do that, and that's not going to be a problem. But let's say you hit that person, they become unconscious, and then now you're hitting them in the head with the bat 20 times after they're unconscious. If they're unconscious, the threat is over. So that is where the police, I'm not saying that's what happened here, we don't know the facts, but how the police are looking at it right now until the court decides is that whatever force was done to this intruder was excessive in the circumstances versus just simply defending yourself.
So the thing I pointed out to a couple of our callers was, in theory, this sounds really simple enough, right? But in practice, you're the person whose home has just been broken into. The person who you confront is armed, and we know that's the case in this particular instance. And you managed to, I don't know what happened. He picked up a knife and he stabbed this guy. You said we don't have all the information here, but if this was simply a matter of him defending himself and stabbing this person, even if he stabbed them only once, let's say he stabbed him close to the heart or in the neck, and by virtue of that, this person now has life-threatening condition, has to be taken to hospital, would that still qualify as aggravated assault?
So the aggravated assault essentially is when you either wound, maim, disfigure, or threaten the life of someone. So an aggravated assault, like a regular assault, like a simple is like you could push somebody and that's an assault. But something that affects your life and that your life is in danger could be considered an aggravated assault. And now, just because the police charge this individual doesn't necessarily mean that a judge will not say, you know what, this was reasonable in the circumstances. I think the hard thing with self-defense cases is it's very situational to specific. It's situational to you as an individual, to the circumstances, what's going on in your house. So, for example, if I have a baby in my house, and let's say that person is advancing up the stairs, that is going to inform the way I react. And when a judge is looking at that situation, they're going to look at that situation and say, is this reasonable in the circumstances that this particular person is in under those particular circumstances?
Now, I don't know, did you happen to hear what Doug Ford said with respect to this?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So this is the Premier of Ontario, who I think reacted the way most people probably would, which is, what the hell, his words were, something is broken. So, go ahead.
I don't know. Doug Ford is a politician. So I'll say that. But at the end of the day, if he's saying something wrong has gone on, the issue here is that we don't have all the facts. And if I recall correctly, the last time that Doug Ford made a comment about Umar Zamir, I don't think he walked it back, but there were some errors in the way that he viewed that situation. So I say in this situation, I'm not saying that this man is guilty or not guilty. We don't know the full circumstances, but I don't think someone can say that there's something that's gone wrong that you can't defend yourself because we don't know within the law what has happened in that particular circumstance. We've heard that this person was seriously injured. We've heard that they were airlifted out of Lindsay is like a smaller kind of town. We've heard that they've been airlifted to Toronto, which is the main city, probably to a trauma center. So we don't know what the extent of the injuries are. We don't know how far this person went, or that the police saw that they felt like this had gone that far. So I think when politicians are making comments, I think we should learn that we shouldn't make those types of just blanket comments until we have all the facts.
Okay, fair enough. I would ask one other question. I'm not sure if this is fair. If it's not, that's fine. Let me know. Let's take the case here of what happened, right? Someone breaks into someone else's home. We know that person was armed. By the way, to be fair, should point out that the assailant in this case has also been charged, right? I think there are 4 counts against him, right? So let's say you were that person, someone breaks in, and in this case, we understand the gentleman had a knife. Let's just say, for example, you would punch someone, right? And after you had punched that person, they fell to the ground, hit their head, and then eventually died, right? And all you did was punch them once, which seems to me like reasonable force if they have a knife. What would happen in a case like that?
So in a case like that, the issue of the fact that the person was somehow died, like if they tripped and fell and busted the back of their head open, you couldn't have foreseen that. And the fact is that your punch is reasonable in the circumstances. The fact that that person died, it doesn't necessarily mean just because somebody died that it has to be that charges are laid, or it has to be that you're found guilty at a trial or anything like that. Because in that circumstance, if you're saying, look, this person had a knife and I punched them to get them away from me, that wouldn't be seen as unreasonable. Even if the person died, things happen. That's why we have different levels of, murder, first-degree murder, second-degree murder, manslaughter, criminal negligence, cause of death, all those types of things. I'm not saying anyone should be charged with that in that circumstance, but not necessarily that there would even be charges laid in a circumstance like that if someone defended themselves.
Last hypothetical. Thank you for playing along. Let's say the situation plays out, okay? And now this gentleman let's say the assailant here is okay. He's going to be eventually, dismissed from hospital. He won't die. Mm-hmm. And then this goes to court, and it becomes an actual he said versus he said. I understand it's 2 gentlemen in this case.
Yes.
Then it's just one person's word against another. What happens then?
So if I was this individual's lawyer, surely I understand that the intruder has a criminal record. It was noted in some article previously. And he was actually wanted at the time, and I think has break and enter on his record. So if I was the defense lawyer for this person, I would be fine with that person taking the stand, because at the end of the day, the fact that they're already breaking in this home, and the fact is I would be asking questions about their criminal record, that they've done this before, if there's violence on their record. So the fact is the credibility and the reliability of that witness comes into play. And if I have my client who has no criminal record, who's never been in trouble before, who's saying, look, this person came at me with a knife, it's not going to be so credible or reliable, hoping that the defense lawyer's cross-examination is great, not going to be so credible or reliable for someone who's wanted for and has, offenses of B&E on their record, broken, is charged with possession of a weapon, to say, oh, no, I didn't brandish a weapon. It's going to be the believability of the stories between the 2 people. And I can say right now that obviously when people have certain things on their criminal record, if they have a history of violence, that person's coming to the court as a witness. So all those things are open season for the defense lawyer to ask about. So for sure, yes, it is he said, but there's going to be credibility and reliability that comes into play.
Well argued, Counselor. All right. Thank you very much. Very much appreciate your time today.
Yes, no problem.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
The very latest news, reported and discussed. Welcome back to Montreal Now on CJAD 800.
All right, so the situation, of course, at Air Canada is that tentative deal is still just that. We've not had a full vote yet from the union. That's expected to continue to take a few more days. But the good news is, if you are one of those people who unfortunately had your flight canceled and it kind of threw you into a bit of a financial frenzy because you had to book a hotel to stay longer or rent a car, Air Canada now says it's aiming to have its full network, first of all, schedule on today. So flights are in fact going. And now they say they've updated their goodwill policy to cover reasonable additional accommodation and out-of-pocket expenses. So let's get some details. Christophe Hennebelle is Vice President of Corporate Communications at Air Canada and on the line. Thank you for your time this afternoon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, let me begin by asking what this means. So when you say, extending the goodwill policy, how would it work and what do you have to do as a customer?
Yep, absolutely. First, I'd like to say that we are very much aware of how much of a disruption that has been for our customers, and we deeply regret it. Indeed, we have an almost normal operation today with 99% of our flights operating. So we are almost back to normal and getting there. Now to your question. In fact, we've modified our usual policies in two ways. The first one that we announced 2 days ago was about transportation back to Canada for people who were blocked abroad. So people who have had to buy a ticket on another carrier, another airline. We've agreed to refund those tickets on two conditions. First condition, that their flight was actually canceled, so that they received an email from us telling them that their flight was canceled. And secondly, that we told them that we did not have an alternative solution, an alternative option for them. So in those conditions, we will refund the transportation, right? Either by air or by land.
Okay.
That was the first part of the policy. Second part of the policy that was announced yesterday is for out-of-pocket expenses. So if, because of the disruption, you've had fees for hotels, for meals, for ground transportation to the airport, for instance, we will refund that as well.
What about your hotel stay if your flight was canceled?
Yes, the hotel as well.
So
the lodging, the meals,
okay.
and ground transportation.
The other question I have, and a couple of people brought this up, if someone had their flight canceled, was made aware that it was canceled, and booked another flight, what we found out was that, unfortunately for many people, that flight cost a lot more than it would have if they'd had their regular flight not canceled. So will you cover that extra cost as well?
Yes, on the condition that it's a reasonable fee, reasonable meaning that it's on par with the market conditions when that purchase was made, and on the condition as well that we did tell those customers that we didn't have a solution for them. Because the first thing we did was look for options for our customers. We rebooked customers ourselves, tens of thousands of customers on other airlines. Now, if we did tell the customer that we weren't able to find that solution and they did the rebooking themselves, then yes, absolutely.
Regardless of how much that might have cost. I mean, I heard a horror story of someone saying they had to fly home from Paris, for example, and that one-way ticket to get home after their Air Canada flight was canceled was well over $2,500.
Well, what we'll do is check that was the price that was in the market at that time. If that's in line with the prices that could be found on the market at that time, yes, we'll reimburse. Okay. If it's way more expensive, then we'll reimburse a reasonable price.
All right. The other thing before we run out of time that I want to clarify as well is this. So if you had to go ahead and book something on your own, right, and you're now going to give them that money, my understanding is you only get that money back, by the way, from Air Canada if you book directly with Air Canada and not through a third party. Is that correct?
You mean like a travel agency?
Yeah, travel agency.
No, that's not correct. You can be refunded even if you book through a travel agency, no problem.
And if you book through, I don't know, Air Miles or Travelocity or Expedia, what happens?
Yeah,
then?
No, all those are travel agencies. They're online travel agencies that exactly the same.
Okay, and for people hearing this who think, okay, this is good news, the airline will refund it, what is the best way to go about getting that refund back? Online, or how would you do it?
Online, absolutely online. Don't call our call center. We know that there's a lot of calls right now and it can take a long time. So please go to the website. There's a form for that. You submit your claim with all the details you have, all the tickets, all the proofs of what happened, and that's the best way for you to get a refund.
Last question I would ask you, what is not covered in this new policy?
Well, hard for me to say what's not covered. Really, what's covered is the alternative means of transport on the one hand, and on the other hand, the lodging, the meals, ground transportation, and telecommunication expenses if you have some, like you've had to place calls home, for instance. Those are the four things that will be refunded.
Which sounds to me kind of like everything. I can't imagine what else would be. I'm only asking in case I left something out.
That's why I could not answer to your question, but yes, that's pretty much everything.
Fair enough. Mr. Hennebelle, appreciate your time. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Have a nice day.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
So there you go. From Air Canada, it looks like they're pretty much covering everything, including the flight you had to rebook on your own on another carrier because Air Canada canceled your flight. regardless of how much that actually costs. So that's good news because we know people paid a lot more to get home than they originally planned to pay to take an Air Canada flight. So as I said, good news. And as you said, if you want to go ahead and begin the process, do it online. Don't call the call center.
This has been the Montreal Now Podcast.
Listen live on your radio weekday afternoons from 2 to 6
on CJAD 800
or through the iHeartRadio app.